We'll start with the kids.
Okay.
All right. Or no, you start, and then you can. All right.
Do you want me to hold it or? Okay.
You got your arms full.
Okay.
I'm Marilyn Ellie. I've been an anti-nuclear activist for a long time, and I've worked to close Indian Point, and certainly our group didn't do it, but the economics did, and that has led to a big change in our energy infrastructure. Listening to Courtney talk about Dr. Courtney Williams talk about Spectra has given me a much clearer idea of all the pipelines and all of the different ways that this fossil fuel infrastructure it really supports itself, and it's been coming together in the Hudson River Valley. The other thing is that there are so many similarities to what you've been facing with FERC and what we are facing with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, an agency that is overarchingly in favor of the industry, rules and regulations that are so broad in general that they do not really require anybody to see what really is happening on the ground, regular and routine releases of either gas and methane or, in the case of Indian Point, radioactive isotopes. All of it has so many different similarities. And Courtney, I'm just glad we're here working together.
My name's Courtney Williams. I live in Peekskill. My day job is as a scientist. I'm a cancer researcher, but in what's little of my free time, I work to halt the build-out of Spectra's Algonquin pipeline through New York.
How'd you get involved in that?
I got involved almost 4 years ago now when my husband went to an info session at the local library and learned that Spectra Energy, a Texas-based pipeline company, wanted to put a massive natural gas pipeline 400 feet from our house, 400 feet from the elementary school we moved here to send our children to, and right underneath Indian Point Nuclear Power Plant.
So, as an activist, you're really working on this for your kids.
I am really working on this for my kids. People kind of ask, like, don't you feel like it's hopeless, or why do you keep fighting? And I kind of feel like at this point it's regret management. You know, if something goes wrong, I want to be able to know for myself and my children that I did everything I could. And I think now, too, obviously, my family could be immensely impacted if something were to go wrong with this pipeline. But even if nothing ever goes wrong with this pipeline, its daily functioning is polluting the air and leaking a potent greenhouse gas, methane, into the atmosphere and contributing to global climate change. So even if my children aren't harmed by this in the near future, their long-term future will be harmed by the construction of this pipeline.
Because of climate change.
Because of climate change. When my husband and I bought our home, we knew Indian Point was there. But like many others, we were lulled into believing that there was someone looking out for us. The government was making sure that they were doing the appropriate things, keeping us safe, all of that. And then as we got involved in this process of fighting the pipeline, and we had to see more of the machinations of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, we really came to realize that no one is watching out for us. It sounds completely preposterous that someone would put a massive and flammable gas pipeline underneath a nuclear facility. And so at first we thought, this will never happen. The government won't approve it. And they did. And when we used the Freedom of Information Act to request documents to see, like, what did they base their analysis on and their approval on, we were flabbergasted by the hand-drawn, illegible scrawl of a map that was actually submitted as part of the documentation to prove that this pipeline was safe. And we realized also that, you know, it almost, in some ways, doesn't matter how safe the plant is, because we know in 2015 there were over 6 significant pipeline incidents per week in the U.S. And by significant, that means someone was killed or injured, or more than $50,000 worth of damage was done. So we now have 3 gas pipelines running underneath a nuclear facility, pipelines that we know blow up pretty much every single day in this country. And realizing that, coming to find out that these pipelines were under the plant, and coming to find out the lax oversight that the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, provides, and seeing how low the bar was for in terms of safety and health impacts for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, it really made us question what is going on kind of in our country. And folks ask us, like, well, why don't you just move away? And I'm like, well, where am I going to move that's 50 miles away from here and allows me to keep my job? And how do I know that where I move next, there won't be a pipeline company coming to take my property and telling me that it's necessary? So it really has made us feel unsafe. Not only here, being 400 feet from the gas pipeline and a mile from the power plant, but in general, because it makes you realize, your property is only your property until a corporation wants it. And we get the emergency evacuation plan from the county for Indian Point the same week every year as we get the pipeline emergency pamphlet from Spectra Energy. And in some years we get them on the same day. And what's pretty preposterous is that they don't even agree with each other. So if the pipeline ruptures and causes a meltdown of the plant, we're not sure what we're supposed to do, because we're supposed to evacuate, but we're not supposed to start our car. We're supposed to call someone, but we're not supposed to use our cell phone, because what you do in a pipeline incident is completely the opposite of what you do in a nuclear incident. So here, being that we're so close to both of those things, it kind of just ups the ante on how preposterous the plans are for keeping this community safe. Yeah.
I found the same thing with Indian Point. It is not different. It's exactly the same kind of operation. One's gas and one is nuclear, but I think we're fighting the same foe.
I think so, and I think that's where we all come together and are going to work together to make our communities safer.
Absolutely.
Right now in the Hudson Valley, I feel like we've kind of got a bullseye on our back, right? So we have Indian Point, and that's kind of the dead center of the bullseye. But running right underneath it is the Algonquin pipeline, and flowing down the river right next to it are the proposed oil barges, and running right across the river from it are the bomb trains carrying crude oil down from Albany. And right across the river from it is the Millennium Pipeline and the construction of the CPV Valley Power Plant to burn fracked gas. And we've got all of this right here in the Hudson Valley, with kind of Indian Point as a ground zero for this. And I feel like we are here a microcosm of what's going wrong right now, which is that we are building out and expanding fossil fuel infrastructure, and we're risking our safety by building it all out right on top of, under, and beside a nuclear power plant, right when we need to be turning to clean and renewable energy. So I think that folks don't necessarily realize that we've got all of this right now, all of this fossil fuel infrastructure and this nuclear infrastructure all right here in our backyard. And we don't need to go to the Dakotas to protest. We've got a lot of people working to oppose the Algonquin pipeline expansion, the Millennium Pipeline, the CPV power plant, the bomb trains and the oil barges, all right here. And all of this work needs to be done. And really, all of this work is interconnected, because we have fracked gas infrastructure that's endangering Indian Point nuclear power plant. We have the closure of a nuclear power plant that's being used to justify expanding fossil fuel infrastructure. We are kind of all intertwined here right now. And I think this is a perfect time for all of us to work together and say, you know what, we oppose all of this. We don't want no sacrifice zones. No one should be in the evacuation radius. Nobody should be in the blast radius of anything. We want clean, renewable, safe energy, and that's it.
Talk a little bit about how that daily operation of the pipeline leaks that methane into the air.
Sure. So New York State banned fracking, and a lot of people think that because they did, we're now safe from fracking. But actually, we're not, because New York State is facing a massive build out of fracked gas infrastructure. Gas pipelines, gas-fired power plants, and gas storage facilities. And the reason that's a concern is because in terms of air quality, many of the same health impacts that people experience living near fracking wells are experienced by people living near fracked gas infrastructure. So with pipelines in particular, there are above-ground infrastructure associated with that. One of the worst is compressor stations. Those are basically facilities that pressurize the gas to move it through the gas pipeline, but they can also depressurize the pipeline and basically just vent the methane and its contaminants into the air. And while the science is developing daily, there is a consensus in the field that there are both short-term and long-term health effects of being exposed to the gas and the contaminants living near these kinds of facilities. There's also metering and regulating stations, which are not covered by typical air permits that are granted to these pipelines because they're not considered a source of pollution, even though if you just walk past it, you can smell that. Another concern is pigging stations, which are basically facilities for cleaning out the solid waste contaminants that build up within the pipeline. And those things are handled as radioactive hazardous materials because of the radon in the natural gas and its decay products. And Spectra's building these kinds of facilities within 100 feet of people's homes right here in New York.
Where's the closest one to where you are located?
So the closest pigging station to us is right here in Buchanan, which is part of the construction of the first segment of this pipeline, the Algonquin Incremental Market Expansion.
And so if I'm understanding this correctly, there are parts of the external operation of the infrastructure for the pipeline that are under air quality permits and part that are not. Mm-hmm. So the compressing stations have to comply with air quality rules. Is that correct?
So technically they have to comply with air quality rules, but one of the loopholes is that Spectra can kind of get a leeway to pollute additionally here in Westchester by saving credits elsewhere. So by diminishing emissions in Maine, they can spend those credits here in New York to exceed the limits that really would be safe for public health. But because of the kind of loopholes that are in place with the Clean Air Act, they're allowed to do that.
So it's kind of like carbon credits.
Yes.
You can buy and sell where you pollute.
Right. So that's there are a lot of concerns. People ask me, well, isn't it dangerous? It's right underneath Indian Point. It's right near the school, right near my house. What are you most worried about? And in a lot of ways, what I'm most worried about is the scenario where nothing goes wrong. And we've got a massively expanded pipeline carrying fracked gas for decades and polluting the air that we breathe. My children live here. We bought this home to raise our family here. And now every single day, if this pipeline functions as it should, it's pumping hundreds of tons of pollutants into the air that we breathe every day, every year.
How does that get measured?
The measuring of the air emissions is self-reported. So Spectra measures its own emissions, and I'm sure they choose the day that's typical. But really, they can choose when they report, and they can choose when they measure, and it's merely a snapshot. We asked the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, which was tasked with the air permits for this pipeline project, to require Spectra to do continuous monitoring and to report those data to a third party that did not have a vested interest in the findings, in order to get a picture of how this pollutes. Because for myself as a cancer researcher, I know that if I dose a patient with one massive bolus of chemotherapeutics, that person's going to die. Whereas if I meet out those chemotherapeutics over a treatment course of weeks or months, the chemotherapy will kill the cancer cells and the patient will survive. So having one snapshot of measurement of emissions and multiplying it by 365 days and assuming that that's the emissions from a whole year really means nothing to me, because a lot of these facilities, it's not a continuous steady leak into the atmosphere. They have times where they vent, and at those times levels of these chemicals, particulate matter, sulfides, all noxious chemicals, basically they peak. And if you're living near that kind of infrastructure, when that peaking happens, you're going to feel the acute health effects of breathing that.
And maybe not even know why you're feeling that way. What effects does it have?
So one of the most widely reported and accepted is headaches, nosebleeds, and respiratory problems. So people with asthma, COPD, those already with pulmonary issues are very, very sensitive to the emissions. The things that contaminate this gas, in addition to the radon, we're talking about benzenes and toluenes and other things that we normally would be told to avoid. But because no one's monitoring this, no third party is monitoring this, we really don't have a clear picture of what Spectra's doing to our communities.
Is there any requirement for Spectra to make public the snapshot that they do take?
They do report the snapshot that they take to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission as part of the environmental assessment, but as a scientist, the kind of reporting that they do would not pass muster for a peer review of any sort, because it really isn't, if you were trying to publish this in a scientific journal, nobody would accept a single snapshot as proof of the amount of emissions. And it's really disheartening as a person who's living here and breathing this air to have the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the EPA, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, all saying that all of the health impacts, all of the environmental impacts of building this pipeline could be mitigated, when they really have no idea of what the magnitude of those impacts are. Because how can you say we can mitigate the impacts on air quality if you never actually measured the impacts on air quality? And that's the situation that we're in. A lot of folks think the government's looking out for them and making sure these companies abide by the law. But really, they're just kind of checking that they dotted their I's and crossed their T's, and there's not really any kind of rigorous scientific analysis done of these.
Well, you're talking about the scientific method, and what you're describing clearly falls far short of that criteria. Mm-hmm. What's to be done about that? What's the next step?
Right now, we're pushing for an investigation of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, which is this commission that's tasked with approving natural gas pipeline infrastructure. And this is a commission that is funded by fees paid by the industry. The commissioners themselves move back and forth between working for the industry and sitting on this commission. We know of many, many conflicts of interest regarding the Algonquin pipeline expansion.
Like what?
And this commission, for instance, the FERC employee who was tasked with overseeing the environmental impact statement for the first expansion of the pipeline is married to a consultant who was working for Spectra Energy on the third phase of this expansion. Additionally, the company that she chose to hire to conduct the environmental assessment was already working for Spectra Energy on an interconnected pipeline. And once the pipeline project was approved, with the determination that all of the impacts could be mitigated, Spectra then hired that same company again to work on the project, which they had just done the assessment for that had been approved.
And tell us the results of that?
So the results of every environmental impact statement ever produced by FERC is that all impacts to public health, public safety, the environment, all of those impacts can be mitigated.
And what are they using for mitigation?
Well, as I said, it's really quite impossible to say that you're mitigating an impact that you have no idea of the magnitude. Right. So, they say things like, put additional facilities in place to capture some of the methane, or build the pipeline deeper under the ground, or put measures in place to make sure nobody can accidentally hit it with a backhoe or something like this. But really, there's no saying that any of that is is successful. For instance, if you look at data provided by PHMSA, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, if you look at the rate of pipeline failures for pipelines built since 2010, they are 3 times the rate of pipelines built in the 1950s and 1960s.
Why is that?
And when you ask PHMSA, how is it that a brand new pipeline is failing at 3 times the rate of old pipelines, they claim that it's new technology. And with new technology comes a learning curve. So they are well aware that the current methods being used to build these pipelines are failing, that there is a trial and error period. But in the case of a natural gas pipeline, when there's an error, it means property is damaged, and at worst case, someone loses their life. And in Spectra's case, they have a poor safety record. Between May of 2015 and April of 2016, one of their pipelines exploded twice. And in the second case, it actually nearly cost a man his life. He was burned severely, lost limbs when his home was leveled by a pipeline explosion. And this was a pipeline that Spectra knew was corroding, but figured they had more time and they didn't have to fix it right away. And then it corroded more quickly than they had calculated, and this man nearly lost his life and certainly lost his livelihood. Now living as an amputee. So this is the kind of company that we're dealing with, that our state government, our federal government allowed to build a pipeline underneath Indian Point Nuclear Power Plant and trusts them to maintain this both, while the plant is functioning, but then also after the plant is decommissioned and we have the 40 years of irradiated fuel stored there in perpetuity with these pipelines running underneath it.
Talk a bit about the blast radius and how close the pipeline is to the spent fuel and what might happen.
Sure. So what a lot of folks don't know, the Algonquin pipeline system already exists. It's actually a 26-inch pipeline and a 30-inch pipeline in that right-of-way, 2 pipelines. Spectra's plan right now is to take the 26-inch pipeline out of the ground in most places and replace it with a 42-inch high-pressure pipeline in its place. The old pipelines, the 26 and 30-inch pipelines, actually predate construction of Indian Point Nuclear Power Plant. So when someone was deciding where they should site their nuclear power plant, they actually chose on top of 2 gas pipelines as the location. Spectra came and wanted to replace their 26-inch pipeline with a massive 42-inch pipeline, which would allow them to carry more gas and to hook it up to export facilities and send it overseas and to Canada. And SEnRG would not allow them to replace the 26-inch pipeline currently underneath the property at Indian Point. So Spectra chose a new route that brings it through Verplanck, and at its closest, it's 105 feet from critical safety infrastructure at Indian Point Nuclear Power Plant. That infrastructure being the switchyard that controls all the electricity to and from the plant. The pipeline is also 115 feet from the fuel supply for the backup generators. So, in fact, if this pipeline were to rupture at that crucial location, it could destroy both the primary power supply and the fuel supply for the secondary power supply for the nuclear power plant. That is of grave concern. The other concern there is that these pipelines have what's called a potential impact radius, which is just a simple calculation for how much area you might expect to be damaged if the pipeline were to rupture. In the case of the existing 26-inch pipeline, that distance was about 425 feet. But we know from real-world ruptures that have happened that is really an extremely rough estimate. In some cases, the damage far exceeded that potential impact radius. In the case of a 42-inch pipeline that operates at 850 pounds per square inch, you're looking at over 800 feet of a potential impact radius there.
Is that like the diameter of a circle that would be?
Well, in this case, it's a cylinder. So basically 850 feet on either side of the pipeline right of way is the area you would expect to be blown up, set on fire, etc.
Destroyed.
Yes, but when you look at the NRC's own some of their own calculations, they were working with 4,000 feet.
Now, you just said NRC.
Yes, sorry. If you look at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's calculations that they had done, in some cases, they were estimating 4,000 feet, which would encompass pretty much all of the Indian Point property. So we really do have a situation where both the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission kind of just passed the buck. They based their safety assessment on an estimate from Spectra Energy that they could shut off gas in the pipeline within 3 minutes. But if you look at the map, the distance between the nearest valves is 5 miles. So you have 5 miles of gas in a 42-inch high-pressure pipeline that still needs to be vented in the case of a rupture. And the local municipality, the town of Cortland, hired a well-respected pipeline safety expert that routinely works with the government on these kinds of assessments, who said that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's assessment was false, and it was clear that they did not have anyone on staff that was a pipeline safety expert, and that in real-world conditions, it would take longer than 3 minutes for Spectra to even identify that there was a rupture, never mind shut off the flow of gas once there was. And I had mentioned earlier their pipeline that ruptured twice in a year. One of those ruptures was a pipeline underneath the Arkansas River, very similar to what's going to happen with the existing 26-inch pipeline going under the Hudson River next to Indian Point. In that case, the pipeline ruptured. It was an auxiliary pipeline, so thankfully the flow of gas had been turned off, but the line was still pressurized. That ruptured, and Spectra had no idea it had even happened until an angry tugboat captain called the Coast Guard, telling them that his boat had been damaged, and the Coast Guard reached out to Spectra and let them know that their pipeline had exploded.
How was his boat damaged? Was it fire?
The hunks of pipeline and cement that had been used to secure the pipeline underneath the river basically went flying into the air, landed on his tugboat, and the Coast Guard put the pieces together and contacted Spectra. And they had no idea that their pipeline had blown up.
So they weren't monitoring that pipeline.
They were not monitoring. Well, they were supposed to be monitoring that pipeline, but they clearly were not. And so is this the company we really want to trust with building and maintaining gas pipelines underneath a nuclear facility 35 miles from New York City?
You mentioned that the pipe underneath the Hudson would be 26 inches, and yet they have a 43-inch pipe they're putting through. Well, what's up with that?
So now they have multiple pipes running underneath the Hudson River. So the new pipeline, the 42-inch, is running underneath the Hudson River south of Indian Point. The 26 and 30-inch pipelines go underneath the Hudson River and then directly under Indian Point property. So we've got multiple pipelines underneath the Hudson, multiple pipelines underneath Indian Point.
Is it two separate pipelines? Because my understanding was that the 46 was going to feed into the smaller pipeline. That's not happening.
I'm going to back up a little bit to clarify. So, as I mentioned, the Algonquin pipeline actually consists of two pipelines, a 26 and a 30-inch pipeline. Spectra Energy would like to replace the 26-inch pipeline with a massive 42-inch pipeline. If they were to tell the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that they wanted to replace the entire length of their pipeline from New York all the way to Massachusetts all at once, the environmental impacts of that would be hard to obscure in an environmental assessment, right? We're talking about hundreds of miles. So instead, what Spectra's done is to segment the project into multiple smaller pieces. So the first portion of their pipeline expansion is called AIM, or the Algonquin Incremental Market Expansion, and it expands portions of the pipeline in New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. And then they plan to come back with the second phase, which is called the Atlantic Bridge Project, that will expand with the adjacent sections in New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts.
And be connected.
And connect up with what was replaced in AIM with 26-inch segments in between. And then they have a third project that they've proposed to come in and finish the last puzzle pieces in New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, such that over the course of these three projects, they will have replaced the entire length of the pipeline. of 26-inch pipeline with a 42-inch pipeline. In the case of Indian Point, SEnRG wouldn't allow them onto the property to replace the 26-inch pipeline. So in Rockland County, the 26-inch pipeline continues on, and the 42-inch pipeline splits off and goes under the Hudson River south of Indian Point, and then connects back up in Yorktown with the existing 26-inch pipeline. So they've basically taken and replaced segments, but here and there. And then as the second phase of the project, they've come back and replaced additional segments. And then in the third phase of the project, they want to come back and put the final pieces in the puzzle.
Weren't they having trouble getting the pipeline under the Hudson River?
They had significant problems getting the pipeline underneath the Hudson, and they were delayed by several months. They actually they drill underneath the Hudson, not in the bedrock, but actually just in the silt of the riverbed. And they tried to push the pipeline or pull it through underneath the river, and it got stuck most of the way through. And in their panic to try and salvage the project, they actually dug up a wetland in Cortland without permission from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They were told by a monitor that they had to get permission. They waited until that monitor had left, and then they proceeded to dig up a wetland along the Hudson estuary without permission. But that did fail. They were working round the clock for hours with extremely loud equipment that people were displaced from their homes because of the level of noise and the around the clock work. And they tried again and again until finally in January of 2017, several months behind schedule, they were finally able to get that underneath the Hudson.
And up on the other side.
Yes, from Rockland to Westchester.
Next steps?
The next steps right now is that they just got approval on May 1st from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, their water quality permits that they need to build the Atlantic Bridge segment of the pipeline in New York, which is pretty much entirely contained within the New York City and Croton watershed. And so despite our best efforts and the efforts of the Natural Resources Defense Council, the New York State DEC and Governor Cuomo signed off on that permit. We were particularly upset by that because we are currently challenging the approval of the AIM project, that first project, in federal court. We're basically just waiting literally for our day in court. We're waiting to be scheduled on the docket. And we had asked the governor and the Department of Environmental Conservation to withhold any permits until the legal proceedings are completed, because the grounds of our legal challenge is that this is actually all one massive pipeline expansion that has been illegally segmented into 3 sections to avoid a full accounting of the environmental impacts. If our case is successful in the federal courts, that will mean that Spectra and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission need to go back to the drawing board and consider the impacts of the entire expansion. They won't be allowed to divide it up into smaller projects. So we've asked the governor to withhold any approvals until this case has been borne out. He did not do that. He and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation issued those permits, even though we also had Governor Cuomo opposing the Algonquin incremental market expansion, that first segment, saying that it particularly the construction near Indian Point posed a grave risk to New York State. And that was in February of 2016. And the governor called on FERC to halt construction near Indian Point, and he also ordered 5 agencies in New York State, including the Department of Environmental Conservation, Homeland Security, and others, to conduct a risk assessment of siting a massive 42-inch gas pipeline immediately adjacent to safety infrastructure for a nuclear power plant that includes New York City and its evacuation radius. And the governor ordered that assessment in February of 2016. It's now May of 2017. We still have not seen the results of this risk assessment. And especially now, as we face the closure of Indian Point and must plan for the safe decommissioning of that facility, knowing what risks having 3 natural gas pipelines running underneath the property at Indian Point, knowing that information is crucial for us to be able to make this community safer, to address these risks in whatever way we can as we plan to decommission. So New York State has really dropped the ball on this. They didn't get involved in the permitting process for the AIM project early enough. They then didn't follow through on their requests for a risk assessment, and then when given the opportunity to halt the construction and hit the pause button and allow our legal proceedings to come to their conclusion, they again passed the buck and approved these water quality permits. So we continue to be frustrated that Governor Cuomo comes out saying he's all for clean energy, and then he allows the construction of all of this fossil fuel infrastructure, fracked gas pipelines, fracked gas power plants, and then as he's giving nuclear subsidies to plants upstate, we're left down here with a situation that he won't address the risks and participate appropriately in the decommissioning of Indian Point.
I have one last question that you might want to expand on a little bit. Who's purchasing all this gas?
The way that Spectra has to dot the I's and cross the T's to prove to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that there's a need for this pipeline is basically to just have customers to buy the gas. And usually those customers are power plants. And so the justification that they give to the federal government, this commission, is that there are power plants in New England that want to buy this gas. And that's the justification. And FERC accepts that justification and says there's a public need, you now have powers of eminent domain, and you can take public and private lands and build your gas pipeline. But if you were a shareholder of Spectra Energy, which Spectra was recently purchased by another Canadian company, SEnRG, if you were one of their stockholders, the story that you would be getting is that they're building out this gas infrastructure in order to be able to export fracked gas. Their plan is to reverse the flow of pipelines that are currently bringing gas down from Canada and send gas north to Canada, where there are liquefied natural gas facilities that can export this gas overseas. So their plan is actually to pass the cost of building this onto these electric companies, onto the power plants that buy their gas, but overbuild this pipeline in order to be able to export this overseas. Because right now in the United States, we have a glut of gas, of natural gas, right? The fracking boom, we are inundated with fracked gas, and the cost is very low. In Europe, they have a need for gas, where right now they get that predominantly supplied by Russia. So if we were able to, I think the geopolitics of it is that if Europe were able to get fracked gas from the United States, it would alleviate their reliance on Russia. But that means that those of us in New York, and no one in New York is getting any of the gas from this pipeline, it means that we bear all of the risk so that Spectra Energy can export gas overseas and make a profit. And that is not appropriate. We think that's a misuse of the law. And quite frankly, it's just straight unfair that we're wrecking our environment. My children get to be going to elementary school 400 feet from a gas pipeline and practicing shelter-in-place drills in case the pipeline ruptures, so that Spectra Energy can make money exporting gas overseas.
What's the gas used for overseas?
It's basically used for electricity generation. Yes.
A question that has been in the back of my mind lately is fossil fuel needs to stay in the ground. However, a lot of people use gas for heat. What about that?
A lot of people do use gas for heat. I don't think people quite realize the impacts they're having. I know for my own family, as we faced this pipeline battle, it made us much more cognizant of how our use of fossil fuels harms other people. So it got to the point where I couldn't go to the gas station and put gas in my car without realizing there's some family living near this well, and some family living along the pipeline, and some family living downwind from the refinery. And that really puts a human face on this, where you don't normally think of who's being impacted by the gas you use. But I cannot fill my tank with gas or turn on a gas stove without thinking about the people who are living with this. But what we need to realize and appreciate is that, for instance, the AIM expansion, the first expansion of the Algonquin pipeline, the amount of additional gas that expansion allowed the pipeline to carry is equivalent to the amount of gas that leaks from Boston's gas distribution system every year. So if Boston were simply to replace the leaks in their distribution system, we would not need the Algonquin incremental market expansion. So we're basically in a position where we are drilling this gas and shipping it along. We're dumping literally hundreds of tons of methane into the air, and methane is 86 times more potent than CO2. And we're dumping that all into the air. This whole system from the wellhead to being delivered to someone's house is leaking massive amounts into the atmosphere and actually accelerating global climate change right when we need to be stopping the use of fossil fuels. And that's one of the things that we're worried about, is that these pipelines, once they're put in the ground, they have a lifetime measured in decades. We don't have decades of time left to respond to global climate change. We need to be stopping this right now. So when we could be investing the $1 billion it cost for the AIM expansion into renewable energy, instead we're using it to lock ourselves into the fossil fuels that are warming the climate. So it's the exact opposite of what we need to be doing right now. What does the pollution do to the earth?
It creates global warming.
Oh, okay. Well, you know a lot. How old are you?
7.
7. Well, I love your Irish reel. You're a good dancer and you really know a lot. So thank you for doing this interview.
You're welcome.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Do you want to talk, or you want to go upstairs to Daddy?